I'm Dr. Kelly Brogan. You may know me as a New York Times bestselling author of a book with an exploding pill on the cover, renegade psychiatrist, pole dancer, or honorary member of the Disinformation Dozen. What can I say? I'm a born provocateur. I've spent most of my recent life exposing deceptions, connecting dots, and discovering the secret places my inner victim is still waiting to be liberated. And now I feel called to help you reclaim all of your parts, your health, your sexuality, your power, and your expression, so that you can finally truly own yourself. I want to ignite in you that inner knowing and the pulsing vitality that lives beneath your disempowerment, disconnection, and resentment, so that you can audaciously, courageously, and playfully alchemize your struggle into the specific pleasure of who you are. This is Reclamation Radio, a Soulfire production. Hi, and welcome back to Reclamation Radio. I am Dr. Kelly Brogan, and I am here so honored and excited and delighted to be in conversation with the one and only Teal Swan. So I have made an effort in this podcast to showcase many of my nerdy colleagues who, are studying in a dusty corner. And I am interested in making sure that they have the microphone. This is a different experience because I guarantee that everybody listening knows exactly who you are. And I imagine has consumed many, many hundreds of hours of your incredible material. And so I really hope that this can be a conversation between two women who have come to very similar perspectives on the subject of mental health, if we can use that very reductionistic phrase, and really just to contribute this to the collective, that there is a growing field of awareness around the nature of mental health, why the concept of mental illness probably should be left in the files of history, and where we should go, moving forward. So I wanted to just relay a funny intro, Teal, because I only came upon your work, I don't know, maybe 3.5 years ago or so. I know you've been at this for a minute. And when I did, I shared a video of yours that was super resonant. I just felt like such kindred energy listening to you. And I shared it with somebody in my life, and that person said, "Oh, no, she runs a cult." Right. And so I come from the sort of truther world where there is a lot of fetishizing about how evil, sort of satanic practitioners are. And there's a lot of sort of like, no, don't go there energy. Right. And I've spent a lot of my recent career exposing the shadow of activism, my own activism included. And so it could have meant something to me, right? Like, oh no, she runs a cult. And instead I felt like even more interested, right? Like I felt like even more intrigued because I myself have been accused many, many times over of the very same thing. And somehow that was the validation that I needed to dive in. And I have since enjoyed, I don't even know, your content is an extraordinary library. It's a gift, really. And I've been to your synchronization event here in Miami and have I just smile every time you speak. So it's really, really an honor to be here with you. And there's so many subjects that we could speak about, man-woman dynamics and so many nuances of, what is happening in this moment for the collective. I would like to really focus us in, however, on this subject of psychology, psychiatry, and mostly because it just feels good for me to have you in my corner. And it might feel similarly for you. And to really unpack, what it is that you have come to understand about the nature of what it is that people struggle with when we call it an illness of that degree. So thank you for being here.
It's good to be here. Yeah. Thank you.
Amazing. So I want to start, Teal, by just zooming out a bit, because I know that you have developed many insights and that they have, of course, as they do, grown from experiences that offered you contrast, shall we say?
Yeah.
And there was earlier in your experience as a public figure, there was a moment where it seems like it became a very important point of advocacy for you to begin to speak on behalf of those who have been psychiatrically labeled, I would say captured by the guild. And I wonder if we could unpack just what that was like for you. Why does this subject even matter? And I know for me, I'll say that I have examined my own process and I have gotten in touch with the part of me that believes myself to be crazy. And so it makes a lot of sense that I created the conditions for me to be on the side of the crazy desk that points the finger, right? So to be the psychiatrist rather than ever, sort of finding myself in the patient role. And that's not something that was available to me years ago. However, I do think that there's truth in it and why many of us are called to explore the nature of, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral well-being is because of our own, the ways that we touch in the liminal spaces of our own, let's say, I'll speak for myself, stability and sense of inner coherence. So I wonder where and how that became a point of focus for you.
Where and how it became a focus to call out the mental health field?
Yeah. And what I felt for you is the advocacy for people who've been otherwise impacted by it, right? So yes, there is a gate, and I'm very interested in this myself and have been, but there is a sort of like, this is what's wrong with the system. But it comes from, it seems to me, from a place of wanting to, like, I would use the word gatekeep, but gatekeep for those folks who might otherwise find themselves wandering the halls, disoriented and potentially abused, if we want to look at it that way.
Well, I think what's scary about my story is that it comes from two distinct places. The first is definitely a personal experience within the mental health profession. And the second is when I have just watched the slaughterhouse, quite frankly, that is the entire mainstream modern health and mental health and wellness industry. So I'm coming at it from this very activist side, seeing people get damaged and also having been damaged myself. It's both. So let's go. You want to go personal first?
Sure.
So when I was younger, I was unfortunately targeted by I'm talking really unwell individual. And I became a full-blown victim of ritual trauma in my childhood as a result of this association with this man. Of course, the sort of preceding factor for me being able to get on the radar of this person was growing up in a dysfunctional family dynamic. So there was a lot of stuff that was happening that was not going good, right? Naturally, when I started to show symptoms from both what was happening in the house and also what was happening within the context of the abuse situation that I was in, everybody got it wrong. Literally everyone. So here I am, basically as a child, being intentionally programmed to not tell people what was going on with me. Walked through elaborate scenarios as to what would happen with my parents, with my pets, if I was to say anything. And as a child, I think it's very hard for people to understand what that's like because we relate to the world as an adult. For example, as an adult, we relate to police officers as public sort of servants of some kind. We know that if we call these people, it's not going to be a bad thing for us. It's going to be a good thing for us if we're in trouble. That is not the relationship that a child has to the police. So a parent, an adult, can form whatever relationship or association that a child needs to have with that at their discretion. So if cops are now the dangerous people who are going to get you in trouble, that's the one to be avoided, right? So you can mess with a kid to the degree that they never will speak about what is going on with them, and yet you see all the symptomology. So I'm exhibiting all the symptomology, both with my parents, and at my school. And so, what happens with a kid who's exhibiting all this symptomology? We immediately throw them into the mental health field. This kid needs help. This kid needs a psychologist. Oh, that psychologist doesn't work. We need another psychologist. Oh, that psychologist doesn't work. Let's try a child psychiatrist. Like, my childhood was a slideshow, a tour of the mental health industry. And it was such a failure. I don't have words. It's marred my whole family. It's not just me that it damaged. It also damaged my parents who, missed everything, reframed everything, took me to people who could not conceptualize of, well, maybe we should extend the idea of who may be abusing her beyond just mom and dad. So it was one of those things where, even the people who did catch wind, wait a minute, every single sign we're seeing in this kid is a sign of abuse. It was like they would finger in on my parents and then they would yank me out of therapy. And then they'd put me with somebody else who was willing to come up with a different explanation. So what happened is by the time I reached 19 years old and finally run away from the abusive situation that I was caught in, I had like over 20 diagnoses. Each time they gave me a new medication, of which I was on so many it was ridiculous, they had to give me a new diagnosis. None of them agreed. Sometimes they'd be sprinkled in the same, but this one says schizoaffective. This one says bipolar. This one says borderline. This one says, it was just, you're sort of sitting there going, you guys don't know what the hell you're doing, do you? And what was really lucky is we ended up with a child psychiatrist, actually, one of the leading child psychiatrists in the nation. My mom takes me to him. He takes me into the room. And I ended up kind of poking at him a little bit, which I used to love to do because I wasn't at the point then where I was working with therapists. I hated them. So it was really annoying to me, especially with all the abilities that I had when I was younger, to be able to sit in a room with somebody and see clearly all these shadows. And yet that person's sitting here sort of making a judgment of what's going on with me, and they're wrong. Okay. So I started poking at him with his life, things that I shouldn't have been able to know. It was with his relationship with his son. So he walks out of the room, walks in with my mom and says, listen, your daughter just basically brought some stuff up she can't know about. My son was severely bullied to the point where he's in the hospital today. I don't know how she knows this stuff. This is beyond what any of us understand. I think she's got a lot of gifts. Nobody knows what's going on in this field, is the reality. This is a study, and that's what most people don't want to hear. So he said, basically, we have a choice today. The choice is I start with the letter A, and I start with the class of drugs that I am aware of that start with the letter A, and we go down the list and just try her out on it. But I don't think that's the way to go with this child. So, it took how many of these professionals before we get to the one who's like, listen, this is not a textbook case. And even with those cases, we don't even know what the hell is going on. And almost admitting that the frustration for a lot of very good people in the field is, oh my gosh, we don't know, and therefore the prognosis for people is very poor. It's terrible when you go to somebody. It's not like when you go to the ER. It's not like you go in there with a broken bone and they're like, oh, we know how to set bones now. This is a wild experimentation.
Yeah, impressionistic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was damaged. I was deeply damaged by that experience. There's just fragments of memories of me, taking things like Abilify and being doubled over on the floor, throwing up blood. Just horrible experiences of telling people, almost like flirting with certain therapists about some of the stuff that was going on with me, and them immediately saying, oh, I've already decided that stuff can't happen. Schizoaffective. So obviously I reached this point getting out of it where I'm still engaging in therapy, right? It's not like I've written off the entire psychology field. Like I have a therapist even now. Why? Because I'm under so much stress in my career. I need somebody to hold space for what I don't see. But, I got out of this and got even more disappointed because, when I got out of this, I had complex post-traumatic stress disorder so severely with dissociative identity issues, so severely that I was having dissociative seizures and just panic attacks left and right and all this classic stuff, right? So I go into therapy and the standard attitude was, there's nothing you can do about this, Teal. The kind of stuff that happened to you happened at such an early age, your brain is actually formed differently and we can do nothing about that. So you're basically looking at this being the rest of your life. And so it was very much this thing of like, these guys don't know what the hell they're doing. If I'm going to want to heal, I'm going to have to figure this out myself. So that's the one part. This gets me obviously off into this huge career, which I've now built for myself, which is just beyond passion for me, diving as deep as I can into breaking all of this down, understanding these things from different angles, listening to what the standard psychology field understands, but also being like, that's crap. That one's crap. Where the hell did you get that from, guys? So it's like I'm trying to weave a tapestry for people, which is more effective. And what I'm hoping for is actually active participation, not a shutdown. I'm not here to basically take the entire mental health industry and be like, you guys are worth nothing, get out of the space. I'm saying, look, if we're both on the same team of desperately wanting people to be able to get past the suffering that they're going through, you need to be open to alternative opinions and perspectives. Because sometimes the most brilliant ideas don't come from inside a field.
Yeah, there's a little bit though, right, of that expression, it's not broken, it was built that way. This may be the conspiracy theorist in me speaking, but I appreciate how much you also see the world through the lens of victim consciousness, right? And if you look at the allopathic system, its diagnoses, I mean, especially in psychiatry where there are no objective measures, no valid instruments, it's all basically a Cosmo magazine quiz, that somebody is filling in the bubbles and picking out of the 500-page and ever expanding dictionary. If you look at how it is designed, it's really designed, maybe not intentionally, maybe not consciously, to render the patient dependent and helpless and powerless. It like kind of doesn't work. Otherwise, like I say, it's like going to the butcher for a vegan meal. It's like you can't have sovereign consciousness inside of that system. And so I think that's part of why I wonder if you would agree, like the integrative model is like a bit of greenwashed allopathy. It's why you can put your fish oils and your therapy and a little EMDR with your Abilify. But is that really getting at the core wound, which is a reification of the I am broken, something is wrong with me, I am damaged, worthless, unlovable, that is reified every time somebody looks at a prescription bottle with their name on it, right?
Yep.
So you did in many ways, shift your focus and decide this is what it looks like. I'm going to empower people who would otherwise be disempowered. I'm going to help people understand why it is that there's nothing wrong with them. That's what I hear anyway in a lot of your teaching. And maybe it's because that's what I believe too, is the good news and the bad news is there's actually nothing wrong with you. So kind of now what? How do you understand what you are experiencing as an adaptation, as a wise response? Like there's an uncomfortable responsibility that comes with that, right?
Well, I mean, it makes me happy that that's what you're taking away from it, because that was definitely not necessarily my intention. My intention was almost more scientific than that. It was literally looking at what is happening, realizing that what is happening is not what is happening, that they don't even recognize that, and being like, this isn't the answer then. I mean, I would love for it to be like more sort of mushy emotionally than that, but it really wasn't. It was literally like, you guys, I don't even know how you can look at this and not get this. How? It seems so dumb, You're seeing my real passion here beyond this one. Yeah.
Do you think there's like parent-child dynamics? Because I have looked through the lens of like parentification of these authorities, whether it's medicine or, educational system or the government or whatever, and how adult patients can derive a great sense of validation from being in that submissive, inferior role of the compliant patient. Like it does work.
Oh, yes, it does. Yeah, of course. I have definitely recognized those. It's the transference basically onto the authority figure in the room, which is that person who's now, instead of what your parents did, now is going to be the person that comes in and, helps you and does support you and takes over and leads and all of those missing needs you had from childhood. Now, everybody who has been a therapist is going to hear this and be like, oh my God, it's so exhausting. Because even that comes with oh, by the way, you can't have that parent figure projected on you without also having the projection of the negative aspects of mommy and daddy. So you quite quickly get into those with your client as well. But let's also not leave out the fact that a lot of therapists love the hell out of this superior position. That is the only way that many of them feel safe actually in social situations. I can't tell you how many therapists I've run across where you get them into a social situation and they're absolutely unable to have a relationship. The only context in which they're able to have a relationship is this top-down therapist-patient dynamic where they're loving the power that they have and they are expecting absolute obedience. And, they're definitely going to not see you as a person with personal power. So it's like there's a lot of these ill kind of relationship dynamics that play out in the therapy sphere to such a severe degree. It's scary because it's like you're constantly navigating a minefield, The people who are not good at navigating that minefield just step right on the landmines and don't even really see the damage they're doing. And the therapists who are really good see that it's a minefield, and their entire existence in their field, it's just, oh, I got to make sure my shadows don't get in the way. I got to make sure that they're doing they're getting their healing experience, but I'm not making them dependent. And yeah, it's definitely a difficult space.
The need meeting is something that I can speak to personally. I mean, there were so many needs that were met for me as, a prescribing MD that were a covert part of the arrangement, right? That were never actually explicitly expressed. And so that's why I wonder about this idea of being like a match for certain experiences. I do believe that the allopathic system has all of the trappings of a hierarchical, like abusive dynamic, right? The gaslighting, the, imposed, first of all, like, let's not even get into things like gynecology or ritualized body penetration, all this stuff, right? So you can just stick to psychiatry and see that there are all of the elements of, if you want to call it like a narcissistic codependent dynamic, if you don't want to use those words, which sometimes I struggle to find better ones, you can see like all the trappings are there. So is it possible, right? Because I went through 10 years as an angry activist thinking that I needed to also my own superiority, right? And like inflated rescuer complex. I needed to save all these women, right, from the abusive system. And then I reflected on like, well, I was a match to that system prescribing, to pregnant and breastfeeding women and all the rest. And then I shifted, right? So what is it to be like a so-called match to abusive dynamics? Like, is there a victim in that situation, right? Or is it the fact that there are, as twisted as it might sound, needs being met, even within this simulacrum of, somebody's childhood abuse that is now institutionalized, right? So I've seen some of my former patients who are emancipated from the system. I have seen them get stuck sometimes in the anger and the pain of identifying, this big enemy, this parentified enemy on the outside. So I like to consider possibilities that it's all by design and it's all in service, and that we are a match to that system. We don't get captured by it and, oppressed by it. Also, because I've been it. So I know I'm the same person. I'm not a better person now than I was then. I just maybe have a bit more awareness. So I wonder what you think about like being sort of a match to the dynamics of the system itself.
I don't think that being a match to the dynamics itself takes the concept of being able to be victimized off the table. We're looking for something that's a lot more gray area. I do, when people talk about victimization and victim consciousness and things like that, it makes me very, very nervous, because there is such a thing as true victimhood. It doesn't matter whether at a higher level we become a match to something for a certain reason, or because our specific patterns feed into something. That awareness just helps us to get out of the powerlessness that we're experiencing in a certain situation. Do I feel like it's really beneficial for us to see these abusive dynamics like one would when they're looking through a victim lens in certain institutions? Yes, I do. Does that then mean these are the bad guys that blank, blank, blank? No, it's the meaning that we add to that awareness that is the problem. It's what we do with an abuser that is the problem also, because that's why I sort of started this off with, my attitude is not that I want to just like take this entire industry and rip it to the ground. There is reasons why they ended up doing the things they're doing. There's reasons why every person who fits into the categories of what I'm describing is engaging in this type of behavior with their clients. And the way to address that is not to, rip their license away and then put them in jail, or, burn up the building that they have their practice in. I see this much more almost like accommodative way of going about trying to understand them and creating ways where there can be a mutual exchange. I would like this to be a win-win instead of a zero-sum game, unless it can't be, if you know what I mean. So,
yeah, unless it's an evolution, right? Like unless the obsolescence of that model is just an organic process as we begin to meet our needs in different ways. But I hear you. And I think that's super helpful. That paradox of like, yes, there is an experience of victimhood. I've been accused of victim shaming people before. So I think sometimes my shadow is that I can have an insensitivity to what it feels like to make the meaning out of a situation too soon, right? Or before the acknowledgement of the actual emotional experience and its imprints, takes place. So I appreciate that. I want to shift to how you have conceptualized, the struggles, right? So whether you mentioned, and we'll use these terms descriptively because that's what they are, rather than diagnostically, they do represent patterns. And that's one thing that I've certainly taken from my conventional training is that patterns are real. They are real. They're observable phenomena, and connecting dots does help us to make meaning out of suffering. And that helps to resolve, right, a lot of the powerlessness that we're discussing. So, patterns like panic attacks or mania or psychotic symptoms, patterns like impulsivity or inattention, that these, phenomenological experiences that maybe even are forms that exist already that people sort of like tap into, I have understood a lot about what you imagine to be the origins of some of these patterns. And I completely resonate. So I'd love, for you to sort of zoom out on how it is that we get caught in these patterns that induce a lot of suffering. Not always, right? I've been told mania is certainly not a bad couple of weeks. Sometimes it's the transition out of it that is, and the experience, the reason that the psychiatric industry exists is because there is an ego dystonic, dynamic. It feels bad to be locked in this pattern of experience. So what do you think is behind that generally?
Behind the...
So let's call it quote unquote mental illness.
Okay. Okay. What drives mental illness is trauma. Like, it's literally as simple as that. People need to understand. It's not about what is wrong with you. It's what happened to you. And that is the story that most people do not want to swallow.
Yeah. Especially, when the chemical imbalance theory, right? And this concept that it's in your biology.
I'm sick of this crap.
So penetrant. Yeah.
I'm sick of this crap is what it is. There was a meme that came out maybe a month ago. It's the first time I saw it, that I absolutely adored. It's this cartoon of a little baby koala who is clutching to the bottom of a tree that's been cut in half. And there's nothing surrounding this tree that's been cut in half, but other trees that are cut in half. And it's sitting there traumatized and shivering. And there's two people with a clipboard, of course, psychiatrists, psychologist types, right, who are writing down, there's something really wrong with this koala. No, there's not, because he's responding exactly as you would expect somebody to respond had they gone through that life experience. So this is the first thing that started to bother me. And this is not just Teal projecting Teal's experience onto the mental health field. I have found this to be the case without exception for every person that I have seen over the last 14 years being in this position. We arrive at these adaptations, which people call the symptomology involved with mental illness, because of traumas that we have experienced. Now, we need to take that concept of trauma and we need to blow it way up. Because when people hear that word, most people are like, yeah, but I never went through a trauma. And I'm like, oh, come see me for one day. Let's see if you have the same attitude afterwards. Why? Because most people, they can only mentally quantify or understand this idea of trauma within the context of something very severe. Something like, well, I don't remember getting into a high-speed car accident at 70 miles an hour. Well, I don't remember somebody, molesting me when I was 8. So we're looking for these big markers, which for our minds, that's the only reason that somebody would be damaged, is if that happens. And I'm needing people to understand that trauma is simply distress without resolution. That is it. That means that when an infant has distress because they're being weaned in a certain way, that actually is trauma. And believe it or not, let's just stay with the weaning theme. If you have gone from this experience of warmth and all of a sudden your needs are just there whenever you need them, to suddenly the thing I need is being deprived. And so I'm developing this craving for it. And I almost have this feeling of starvation in my being. And that's my new relationship to the world is, oh my gosh, when I need something, it doesn't come. This kind of trauma can be at the root of all kinds of issues with abundance when a person is older. Just that. So I'm not just talking about these things that we would classically call mental illness. I'm talking trauma is the root of the discomfort and the issues that we're having in general in our adult life. It's just that with mental illness, we're looking at this very specific grouping of behaviors, which makes it functional behavior quite difficult, whatever we want to define functional as, right? So things like I can't go through the day without having so much anxiety that I can't really, interact with people socially, for example. Okay, so let's go back to trauma. Trauma is the reason why we have these symptoms crop up that we have now lumped into these diagnoses. But each one of these represents an adaptation or a reaction to an adaptation that we have made. So let me explain how this works a little bit. Let's say that you've got somebody who is cutting. So let's say you go into a therapist and you've got this person is cutting themselves, and a lot of therapists are like, oh, well, cutting definitely fits into the diagnosis of borderline. So they're like watching already for, the other markers of borderline personality to kind of slap that label on them. What people are not thinking about is the why behind these behaviors. Why are they not thinking that way? Because there's already an assumption that all of these behaviors that are causing a negative effect in a person are not benefiting them in some way. That's one of those moments. Remember I said where I'm just watching this stuff going, how dumb can you be? How dumb can you be? Literally. Because it becomes so obvious when you start to break it down that all of these behaviors that fall into the category of self-sabotage, they're not self-sabotaging. They help the person in some way. They're an adaptation and they work very well in specific environments. That may not be the specific environment that a person is in now. It may be, may not be. You may not be able to get rid of it. Why? Because it may still be serving them. But I guarantee you, if a person has that adaptation, it's because at a certain point it benefited them. So let's just look at cutting. And I could, of course, make this more complex than I'm going to be able to make it to in sort of like a pitch like this. But okay, so cutting, what does it do? It enables people to see pain that the person can't otherwise express. It's a form of self-regulation. Why? Because you are creating an intense release of chemicals in the body that actually calm you down. So obviously this maladaptive strategy, something we would look at and be like, oh my gosh, that person's ill. Actually, what they're doing is meeting a need right now. That's why they can't let go of it, because it meets a need. And this goes all the way down to, with anxiety, you've got the hypervigilance. That makes a lot of sense. If I was going to take that person and drop them off in a dangerous environment, this is a person who thinks everything is dangerous. Of course, anxiety makes sense. Right? So when we start to look at it this way, where it's an adaptation to a trauma, all of a sudden it changes the entire way that we would deal with it, doesn't it? Because now instead of being like, oh God, they've got a problem, I got to medicate them. It's like, wait a minute, cutting is serving a function. Let's figure out what the function is. Based off of figuring out what the function is, we can actually paint a picture of what went wrong here, even if the person is currently suppressing memories, which is an absolute reality. If you want me to get into that fight, okay. Suppression of memories is an absolute reality. The vast majority of people, especially if they spent their childhood dissociated, do not remember the things that happened to them. Okay, so but even if that is the case, if a person is in the role of a therapist and they're watching this whole dynamic between the adaptations that people have made and what that's doing for a person, it's very easy to trace it back to be like, well, what might the trauma be then? If a person is like doing this, what they're getting out of, say, cutting is something like, you see my pain, then it's like, all right, instead of having a conversation around, how do we stop the cutting, sweetie? We have a conversation around what pain needs to be seen, genuinely. So you start to go down to the absolute root of the trauma that a person experienced and start to develop a framework for what the healing of that pattern looks like. It would blow your mind to see how fast people get through these things. Things where previously people would have been like, well, that's a lifelong diagnosis. Want to bet?
Yeah,
Want to bet me? Yeah.
Of course. I've been on a journey of maturing my inner masculine and feminine, and I've needed all of the energetic support I can get. I have been using one of my favorite resources, which is Lotus Way, flower elixirs, mists, and oils. I use one called True Strength, which smells amazing, to support my self-containment as a professional and as a mama, and Wild Abundance to support my, wild abundance. And I'm a scent girly. So the pleasure of these scents is so amazing every single day. If you want to customize your sensory and energetic support, head to lotusway.com and use the code Kelly15 for 15% off. The link is in show notes for you. I wonder if you have intuited or observed specific patterns of, woundology, unsafety, trauma with these specific patterns of diagnosis. Like I would say, also, because I've heard you talk about this, so I'm teeing you up, but like mania, like how would mania be adaptive? How would depression be adaptive? How would psychosis ever be adaptive? Right. So I think that's what some people might be thinking with these more quote unquote severe or extreme manifestations of different ways of living the human life. Can you sort of speak maybe to those specific examples?
Well, with psychosis, for example, there is absolutely no pressure on the person themselves. They literally have let themselves go completely. There's no pressure to stay in line. And it's not until you really go into the experience that somebody who's in psychosis has, but you have to do that to realize how much tension you have in your being to try to stay on track and stay in alignment and stay, like with psychosis, it's gone.
The regulator has left the building. Yeah.
There's the feeling actually when you're in it is almost like it's what people sometimes flirt with wishing they could do, where it's like you literally have stripped yourself naked and you've thrown shit through the window and like, who cares whether all the windows are broken, and you're like rolling around on the floor and like it's like a complete opposite of inhibition type of experience there. And what you see when before people go into this type of a state, is this, the pressure is building in their psyche. So that's one thing that feeds into. Also with psychosis, you get fantasy realities. It doesn't take a genius to see where fantasy could be an adaptation if the reality is so hard to accept that you can't go there. It's actually why, some people, when they go down the shamanic path, they actually end up in psychosis. A lot of the reason why is because these deep healing techniques that cause people to look very deeply at the reality of what they went through. Sometimes a person just has such a hard time with the pressure of swallowing that they just slip right into, oh, I can't hold this. I actually can't hold this in my being. And I can't process this mentally. And so sort of slipping into this fantasy reality feels 100 times better, right? Okay, so that would be one example. I've actually toyed with the idea of going into these sort of traditional diagnoses and breaking them down in this way. Of course, the mental health industry is very uninterested in me doing this because, they're like, unless you have an actual license, then we are not going to allow you to even use these words. If so, we're going to go after you for practicing therapy without a license. So right now I've got the mainstream mental health field against me in this respect. Of course, we run into the issue where if you go ahead and you do that and you get a license, they take it away if you don't say exactly what they want. So, Okay, so let's go on to another one. So manic depression is an entertaining one because you've got with that a very specific split within the psyche. Now, trauma creates fragmentation of the stream of consciousness that is a person. Now, if you're in the mainstream psychology world, you're going to think of this in terms of a person's psyche, splits within the psyche, which is an absolute reality for all people. It doesn't matter whether we've diagnosed them as multiple personality or not. So with manic depression, what you have is this drastic split between a part that is completely in despair about something that they're going through. I see this a lot in families that are really put together families where there's a high emphasis on the way things look, produce a hell of a lot of manic depression. Why? Because when a child goes through something that really causes them immense amounts of pain, they are expected to shut up, stuff it up, and behave in the way that they are, needing to behave. So what happens is they develop a split between the part of them that is desperate and in despair, and a part of them that is adopting essentially the parental way of going about dealing with emotions, which is a very avoidant way of dealing with emotions. They essentially internalize that. That's an adaptive strategy. They internalize the way of getting away from emotions. And then that is the manic part that is trying desperately when they start to feel that despair creep up to drag them out of it in every way possible. So this is an internal protector part that is like, sirens, bells, whistles. Let's do anything we can to not feel that way. Oh my God, you guys, let's go party for 8 days in a row. Woo! And then you can't maintain this. So eventually what will happen is the attempt to run away from and resist this gets so strong that and all of a sudden the one that's in despair takes over and you see this person just in a hole, right? But then they never actually go all the way through what despair they have and what actual changes need to be made to their life based off of the despair that they're in. And so they just get that right back into the cycle of how we deal with emotions in this family. It's just you're watching that external dynamic that was happening in the family internalized. Okay, well, that makes sense, kind of, right?
It does. And it's that concept that if apparently Krishnamurti did not say this. I'm finishing editing a book and I put this because I say it all the time. And then one of my editors was like, no, he actually didn't say this, that it's no sign of health to be well adapted to a profoundly sick society, right? This idea that there are individuals who we pathologize. So the identified patients who are actually reflections of their systems, and that it actually is functional for them until some moment where it's not. So I've interested myself a lot in that moment, right? So why did people end up, in my field, in my practice or doing my protocol? Like, what was the moment where it stopped working sufficiently where they were seeking something else?
Oh, I can tell you that moment exactly.
Yeah. I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah. That moment happens when an adaptation that we made to something is now interfering with something else that we deeply want.
That we value. Yeah.
Yep.
I love that. And I think for many, the answer the desire, the longing, that yearning is to feel whole, right? Like to feel connected to something that matters, whether you call it God or source or spirit. I think that it's the soul, like rattling the cage. And I know that you are also somebody who's seen the power of parts work. You referenced some of the terms, that internal family systems use to understand this circus that we all are. And I wonder, what you think about the role of safety in this self-reclamation, restoration, regeneration, integration process. Because, if these trauma adaptations are driving these behaviors and they rendered that individual safer at some point in their existence, how do we create, safety electively as adults? How does that look? What are some of the tools that you found to be effective?
Well, obviously, that's going to depend a lot on the specific circumstance that a person has gone through, what their definition and experience of safety is. Why I'm saying this is that let's say that somebody has a history where they've got all kinds of unsafety dynamics that are happening in like fancy locations. This person is not going to feel safe in a fancy location. So even down to designing or helping a person to design their environment in a way where they feel like they have control over that experience of safety is an important element of this whole thing. But by far and away, the most important element of creating safety is what's happening within the context of relationships. So to develop safety in relationships is absolutely necessary for us because we are a relationally dependent species. And another thing which most people don't want to accept, and I'm quite frankly so sick of this, because in the mainstream mental health field, there is an absolute obsession over independence. I'm talking an absolute obsession. Now, what I'm saying is that personal empowerment does not have to disinclude people. Right now, we're treating it like it does. No, it doesn't. And no, not all your needs can be met by you. Sorry. So basically, relational dependence, right, is something that which we have to accept about ourselves if we're ever going to create a safety for somebody and if we're ever going to meet our needs as a species, which we must do. We have got to accommodate for our humanity. Okay, so relational dependence. We are a relationally dependent species to a degree that most people are completely unwilling to swallow, much more than other species. And I find it interesting because human beings will look at herd species and we go, oh my gosh, it's so terrible that pack animal, like that dog, is stuck by itself inside of that little cage. Oh my gosh. Same thing with like deer or horses. I love to have this conversation with people where I'm like, okay, so play this out with me. Do you think it makes sense to walk up to a deer in the middle of a herd and say, sweetie, you really need to work on independence. I think this is real dysfunctional that you rely on your herd so much. We would never do that. Why? Because we have accepted that that is a herd species. And yet we make a deer look like nothing. A deer comes out of the vaginal canal and is literally standing within a matter of minutes. How long does it take before that adult deer can function completely on its own? Guess what? Watch a human. You lay a baby out on the sidewalk and it is done for. And if you watch that, that's for years. I mean, we are so relationally dependent that our entire nervous system is wired into our safety being dependent on our relationships. And this is not something that should change or does change when we suddenly reach some magic threshold where, oh my gosh, a person can reasonably walk from point A to point B without a person or can reasonably go try to find food. Okay, no, we are a relationally dependent species 10 times worse than what you see with dogs and with deer and with horses and these types of animals. Okay, so that means that the picture of human health must include relationships. So when I'm focused on creating safety, that's the primary place that I'm looking at. Why? Not only because we are relationally dependent and absolutely need that for the sense of security and safety, but also because if you look at the overall picture of human struggle on Earth, what will depress you the fastest is the fact that the vast majority of our pain comes from each other. That's where the unsafety is. It's in relationships. Okay, so then that means that what we need to do to create safety is to create safety within relationships. How do we do that? Well, first of all, we get people to understand that it is absolutely not possible to play a zero-sum game. We've got to start caring about each other. And in fact, if we don't start caring about and for each other, we will suffer. It is not possible in the closed system like life here on Earth to do damage to somebody else and to not experience the repercussions of having done so. At the very least, we should be able to see that if we create an unsafe or a painful situation for somebody, they are forced to do none other than to go into protector personalities. And if you would like a dangerous world, just look at a world where everybody's walking around in a protector personality. It's going to be a problem for us all. So So humans need to work on building trust first and foremost. Trust is you can rely on me to act in your best interests. I'm going to indicate to you that I'm a safe person because I care about your experience. Are we doing that in society? No. All we have to do is walk through TSA. How many people get through TSA without on the other side? So is like what we see here is we can practice this concept of creating safety in our primary relationships, but blowing that out to a much more important level for us in this conversation today is we absolutely must change the way that we interact with ourselves within society, and we have to change the structure of society to something that actually benefits human health. We have to make the society one where people feel a sense of safety, not a society where people have to armor up to deal with each other every day. And unless we're able to do that, we're just going to keep perpetuating this whole cycle of trauma and adaptations to trauma, and then all of the negative effects that has, and then having to unwind everybody from this. And what I'm really seeing is that where this is going to start is really in our relationship with our children. That's the foundation for this whole thing. The way that they are interacting with us when they are children as their parents and caregivers, the way that we are setting up schools for them. Why do I say that this is so important besides the fact that that is the foundation of life? Because those are the people that are going to design this society. And you better believe that if we give them this experience where they understand what safety is, they're not going to create society the same way. They're not going to have the tolerance for human pain that we have today.
I found as a mother of two teenage girls that the greatest offering, right? So I was very militant about holistic living, and I am a believer that you can send biological signals of safety. In fact, I have a whole protocol that does that, right? So I do believe in the relevance of like raising your children to be aware of all the toxicants in the world and all the things. But what I unfortunately more recently recognized was the ways that I can confer safety to my girls is number one, by acknowledging their reality, right? Yeah. Literally. And that can only happen if I have a regulated system, right? So like how dysregulating it would be to me to not impose my reality and my perspectives, my beliefs on their differing reality, perspectives, and beliefs. It just wasn't available to me because my system was not regulated enough. So I know that you offer, could I call it a methodology, an approach called the completion process, which I would say is one of the ways that internal, right? Because if we do have responsibility relationally for bringing a regulated system to a dynamic, how do we do that, right? So I know that I think of something like the completion process as being one of the ways to do that. So I wonder if you could speak a little bit about, what that is and its intentions and where you think it's best applied.
Yeah, so the completion process is a process that I created ultimately to deal with these very undealt with traumas, therefore to undo the adaptations that we had to make as a result of those traumas. So what I start with is the exact opposite presumption that the people in the mainstream mental health field have, which is that triggers and flashbacks are a problem. Instead, we start to work with them under the premise of the body doesn't actually do anything against itself unless doing so serves a purpose, and therefore it's not against itself. So we start to look at triggers and flashbacks as the very things that are trying to get your attention desperately to what is unresolved within you. We work with those directly as almost like wormholes to bring a person back into what is unresolved. And by doing so, to learn what we need to learn from the unresolved experience, to accept what we need to accept from that experience, and to reverse the process of dissociation that occurs in trauma. When we are choosing willingly to go through and re-experience something, first of all, you can't consider this re-traumatization because a person's going in by choice. By definition, that is not what has happened when somebody had that original event happen, right? Even that changes the whole entire experience that a person has if it's a choice for them to revisit an experience. But a lot of the reason why we become stuck on these traumas is because in the moment of trauma, we dissociated from the experience. When we go back and we re-experience what we went through, we are reversing that process of dissociation, which is very profound, especially when it comes to people's energy bodies. Of course, this is taking people way out on a limb, not necessarily staying within the context of the mainstream medical field. But when we're reversing this process of dissociation, we're bringing a person's life force out of where they're stuck in the past back into the now. And this is very profound because most people who, especially those that are highly traumatized, are walking around with a 30% battery because the vast majority of their personal energy is actually in the past, not in the now. So once we have done that re-experiencing process where we gained all the information and all the experiencing that we needed from that particular part of it, this switches to an active visualization process. We start to own our life again, which pulls us out of the victimhood. Instead of being somebody for whom this just happened to, we're now an active participant in the resolution of what is unresolved. So that involves a lot of need meeting. That involves caretaking the child who is within the traumatic scene, right? That involves resourcing things that may not have been available to you at the time. A person gains so much awareness about themselves, about why they do the things they do, about what they desperately needed and currently need. And so they're meeting that need in this process. We're also creating separation and distance through several steps in this process between what they went through and where they are now, to kind of lead them to the space of like, wait a minute, that's not necessarily going on anymore. I can have a different life experience. And after this whole process takes place of resolution, you get to this sensation of almost being complete with that specific trauma that you experienced. Once you have done that and the person comes out of it, it's like psychic surgery. It's not like a meditation. I mean, this is not a trite self-help technique. It's really intense. But you come out of that and then you go on to figuring out the practical application for what it is that you just experienced. And that practical application gives people a template for how to practically change their current life so that their current life is no longer a byproduct of that trauma. And this can be painful sometimes. It can be things like, I need to leave this abusive relationship. It's not fun leaving a relationship. That's not fun. So it can be something like that, right? But it can also be something that is really fun. Something like, wait a minute, I got this issue with feeling deprived of food. And what I really needed was to feel like I could actually be nourished. And so now the step forward is every time I go to a restaurant, I'm going to let myself get the thing on the menu I really want instead of always picking the thing that's $3, That's a fun thing. Instead of being the person who dictates your whole life according to this self-control that's the ultimate byproduct of trauma around deprivation, suddenly you're like, oh, I can have it. That does feel good, So it totally depends on the specific trauma, what a person ultimately decides to do with their life to change their life so it's not such a byproduct of the things that they went through and is more in the direction of what they're consciously wanting to live. And this is really what owning your life is about. Because a lot of times when we talk about personal responsibility, it's like, it's become a dirty word, especially for people who have been truly harmed. Because the feeling of, having somebody really do damage to your life, I mean, very deeply, and then have people be like, well, it's your responsibility to get out of it. It's like a level of pain where you're just ready to do yourself in, honestly. So what I want people to get is that you don't even need to go down the road of, I need to take personal responsibility for what I went through. You don't, actually. You have every reason, most people do who have been through trauma, to lay on the bed and to give up. It's really about, I've got this life. Like, yeah, I could choose to end it, but like, I have this life. I must be here for a reason. What would I do, honestly, with my life if I really owned all of it? And so processes like this, and really biting down on committing to resolving the trauma that happened. It's not about whether it's your responsibility or not. It's about the fact that ultimately you're not going to be happy unless you really, really own your life. And that's going to be really hard. But it is going to be worth it. It's going to be better, at least, if what you're doing is, all right, nobody was around to rescue me. And yet here I am at point A. I would like to be at point B. What is the first step that I can take? That is at least empowerment. Empowerment is way better than where most people are today.
Amen. I know you're also focused recently on what I would call like legacy burdens, lineage level, ancestral issues, and the balance of, the it didn't start with you phenomenon with that personal responsibility for the narration, if nothing else, of your experience. It's hard. I'm very passionate about family constellation. In fact, I just got off a training call, and it's where those things meet, right? Like what your ancestors gave you, your loyalty, to those lines. And also, as you say, what are you going to do with it now? Like it's this intersection is very sacred. So I wonder if you could share a bit about what you're up to.
Yeah, my passion. I have so many passions. This is me all the time. Oh, that's my favorite. Oh, no, that's my favorite.
You're not a double Gemini, are you? Because that's my excuse.
I am so much Gemini, it's nuts. Okay, so ancestral trauma is an absolute passion for me. I have just become obsessed with this whole thing because it makes life so rich. The understanding of all of this does, the story of you started so long before your individual existence. And if the sort of picture of that, when you get down to the minutia of it, makes it so that you understand that the amount of energy that went into the making of you in this universe is so extreme. There is no way to feel insignificant within that picture. It's not possible. It's like an orchestration on a level that you cannot imagine. So yeah, I'm very passionate about this. Obviously, ancestral trauma, you're suffering from it no matter what. Actually, the vast majority of the traumas that you yourself experience, we could call ancestral trauma. Why? Because it was your interactions with your parents, why are they that way? Because of their interactions with their parents. So we are all of us dealing with ancestral trauma, whether we are going to call it that or not. I just feel like the awareness of these patterns having not started with you or even mom and dad or even, grandma and grandpa is this very juicy type of experience because it makes it a lot less personal.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like when it becomes less personal like that, it's actually easier to sort of step up and be like, wait a minute, I'm just a small picture of this whole dynamic here, which has been going forever. And that makes it actually easier for me to step up into the place that I want to take within this family line. Like, this is a disease at this point. Do I want it to keep running through this line straight down to my children and their kids' kid? No, I don't want to do that. So now it's almost like you're not just doing it for you. You're almost like doing a favor to your entire family line. And what's interesting about this is that most people get really stuck on their family line being just about the people that they knew in their lifetime. But your family line is so much more dynamic than that. There may have been a third great grandparent that you loved that would have adored you. So if you are aware of that, you should not necessarily define your whole family line by those very specific and limited individuals which you had interactions with in your life. It becomes more compelling to step up on behalf of your whole line, And for a lot of people who have had a lot of pain with people in their lives, specifically because here I am specializing in the super trauma situations, it's quite powerful and important when you connect to somebody in your family line rather than feeling just abused by them, totally disconnected from them, like you don't belong with them. The picture of piecing together yourself within this bigger story of your family line, it changes your identity for the better. It definitely does. I've watched it empower people immensely. Not only that, a big part of ancestral healing is not just about identifying these negative patterns that are running through a family line and changing them, or these negative ancestral loyalties and changing them. A big part of it is owning these positive attributes, which are running through every single family line without exception. It's tempting for people because of black and white thinking and not really liking cognitive dissonance to be like, oh, my family's all amazing or all crappy. No, guess what? You start to piece out the story of your family line and you're going to be horrified and amazed. But like part of it is to see those amazing elements and to realize, you know what? I may be working on a lot of stuff here that's really difficult, maybe more difficult than some of the people that I know in my life. However, look at this stuff I don't even have to work on. Thanks.
Yeah.
Coming into your ancestral powers is a very profound thing for people also. And that's something that I think that can be very easily and would incorporate it into this picture of overall therapy, whether people are doing it in the traditional therapy setting or not, because it's so important to reflect to people the things that are excellent about them, not just what is ill. So this illness model of like, well, you've got all these things wrong, let's work on what's wrong with you. We can't have that as the full picture of how to heal from something. There also needs to be this other piece, which is like, do you understand how amazing you are at this? I don't know if anybody's ever reflected this to you, but like, you don't need to work on this at all, unlike so many people. So here's your nugget. We're almost like building up a person's self-awareness. And that's going to include these aspects which are really not benefiting us very much right now, which we can work on, and these aspects which absolutely are, and we need to lean into and on.
Absolutely. And also the appreciation of, that alchemy historically, right? So how our ancestors have turned, shit into gold,
Yeah.
so that we can, carry that in our pockets and to remember that that's the nature of, the experiences that befall us, or feel like adversity or challenges. And I couldn't agree more. We'll have in show notes what you're up to and what you're offering with regard to, these points of focus. And I'm just sitting here thinking, I observed early in my career that those who are captured by the psychiatric system are the canaries in the coal mine, are rightly sensitive to, what is very wrong about how we are
Yes.
living. Yeah. And I just see you as such a living example of that, such an affirmation of my perspective because of what you have, alchemized in your experience and process. And I bet you would, on some level, look back and say, I guess it had to be exactly that way, in order for me to be this extraordinary light. And even if there are parts you would edit, right? It's like, what would have changed though, if you did edit and the dominoes fell differently? So I like to really, turn on its head this idea, as you do, that there is pathology in people who are not well adapted, right, to what we have going on, and to change the story in the ways that you are contributing to. I'm super grateful that I consider you an incredible ally, whether you know that or not, and just grateful, that your perspectives are out there, that you are compelled, I know the feeling, to share them, maybe even despite yourself. And sometimes when you wish, you weren't beholden in ways to the microphone. I'm glad that you walk up to it. And I'm just tempted, Teal, to ask one totally unrelated question before we close, because I really wanted, and perhaps one day I will have you on again to speak more to this subject, because I know there's a lot to say.
Yeah.
I am very interested in this concept of safety that we've been talking about. And I have been focusing on how it is that we can learn as women to generate safety in our own systems. I call that, I have teachers who think it's annoying when I do this, but whatever. I call that the inner masculine. And also translating that to relationships with men that women have with men, not just romantically, but because we walk the earth with men as women. And this concept of the zero-sum game that feminism has offered us on a platter. And I know you have a lot of opinions about this, but I wonder if you could leave us, because I see these topics as very related. And I don't know a lot of other people who are connecting dots, across health reclamation to what I would call feminine reclamation, other than you, maybe a handful of others. So I wonder if you could speak just very briefly, teaser, about the subject of the zero-sum game of feminism and how you think it's relevant to this whole concept of, a safer world, a safer experience for women in the modern moment. Also because of this relational concept, because if we are to master relationships, as you say, how does that implicate feminist ideologies in, a lot of the ways that we have failed to explore healthy relationships?
To understand this picture, we have to go back to the feminist movement itself. And the origins of that are nested in very painful experiences in a world that was made for men by men. And there was really no option to gain empowerment except for the masculine way. So what we have as the major shadow of the feminist movement is this movement which on the surface professes female empowerment, but in fact is nothing more than we can be men too.
Mm-hmm.
And we have killed our feminine essence this way and set ourselves up, because we can point to things that are beneficial about obviously what we went through. Anybody who doubts what the feminist movement did should just go live in the 1950s again and, experience what it is to not be able to get out of an abusive relationship because you're legitimately stuck. You can't even get a credit card. So we can point to these positive things that came, but here's the major shadow that we're all living in, is that when women went and became men, they cut off their powerful femininity, and we made femininity wrong, bad, and weak. Not only that, we killed our bodies. Not only that, we've now set ourselves up so that we're doing everything. So now a lot of women are having this crisis of like, what the hell are these people here for? If I'm doing everything, I'm doing the house, I'm doing the kids still, I've got this full-time job, like, why are you here?
And they're the perpetrators, violators, abusers. They represent that, right? So it's almost even worse. Yeah.
So now it's been interesting, because it was supposed to be pro-women, but it's turned into women being anti-women, actually becoming men and then hating men. And now we don't want there to be men. And now it's time for women to be in power. And yet it's not women that's in power. It's men with female bodies in power, because that's how they're making themselves act, right? So what we are needing very, very powerfully is for women to understand that they are a different element. Like, as a woman and a man, you are two different elements. I don't want us to get into this conversation as genders as to which gender is got to be in power or is better or blah, blah. Like, we need to drop this off the table, which is why I want people to think in terms of elements, because we're not sitting here having debates all day about whether water or fire is better or worse or whatever. We're literally like, wait a minute, these are super necessary within the overall picture of life on Earth. And they do very different things. And they offer very different qualities and resources. So for women, it's like, it's very important for them to get in touch with that essence that is female and to bring that out into the world, which is a very powerful force. You know, things like wisdom, that's a female trait, for example. If so, just think about just wisdom. If we brought wisdom out into the world, then, and we led with that foot rather than, say, competition, which is a male trait. By the way, I'm saying this loving competition myself. So if we're going to bring out wisdom versus competition, it means that we're kind of doing different things than the other person would be doing. And that in and of itself is going to restore a hell of a lot of the, quote, balance which we have been looking for, especially in our bodies, which we're headed towards a fertility crisis and a women's physical body health crisis unlike anything we've ever seen before. So it's necessary, super, super necessary.
Couldn't agree more. Thank you, Teal. Thank you. This has been super fulfilling and validating and affirming, and I'm grateful for and to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.